Something about this story was never sitting right. And now it looks like even the family closest to Charlie Kirk is finally starting to speak out. Because a new wave of claims, allegedly coming from Charlie Kirk's own sister, has just sent shockwaves through social media. And what she's reportedly revealing about Erika Kirk is not just surprising, it's disturbing. For months, the public was sold a picture of a perfect relationship, a strong political power couple, and a story that looked almost too polished to question. But behind closed doors, people are now asking if that image was carefully controlled from the very beginning. And according to the explosive chatter spreading online right now, Charlie's sister is allegedly hinting that what really happened inside that relationship was very different from what the public saw. We're talking about claims of tension, pressure, shifting dynamics, and moments that supposedly never matched the public narrative at all. And the most shocking part? These are not just random internet rumors anymore, because now the conversation is being tied directly to someone from inside the family's circle, which raises one terrifying question. If someone this close is finally speaking up now, what exactly were they seeing all this time that the public wasn't allowed to know? And why is it only coming out after everything has already changed? Because if even a fraction of these claims are true, then the entire story people believed about Charlie Kirk and Erika Kirk might not just be incomplete. It might have been something completely different from the start. And what comes next could completely flip everything the internet thought it understood. To understand why this situation is suddenly exploding again, you have to go back before the headlines, before the online arguments, and before the family statements that are now being dragged into public discussion. Because what people are seeing now is only the final layer of something that allegedly built up over a long time. Charlie Kirk, in the public eye, has always been associated with politics, influence, and strong opinions that naturally attract both supporters and critics. That kind of visibility creates a life where every personal detail eventually becomes public discussion, whether you want it to or not. And in the middle of that world, Erika Kirk became a name that was often discussed alongside him. At first, their relationship was presented in a simple way. Two people meeting, connecting, and building a life together while navigating public pressure. From the outside, it looked structured, confident, and stable enough to withstand scrutiny. But in stories like this, the public version is never the full version. Because according to online discussions that are now resurfacing with new intensity, there were always whispers about how fast things moved, how smoothly everything aligned, and how quickly a private relationship became a public narrative. And that too perfect feeling is exactly what people are now re-examining. The internet has gone back to old interviews, old appearances, and old clips, trying to find anything that looks slightly out of place. Not because there is clear evidence of wrongdoing, but because once suspicion enters a story, everything starts to look different under that lens. And that's where Charlie's sister has now been pulled into the conversation. According to viral claims circulating online, she is allegedly hinting that what the public saw was only one version of reality, and that the internal family perspective may not have always matched the public image. That alone has been enough to reignite massive debate across platforms. Because when family enters the narrative, everything changes. It stops being just speculation between strangers online and starts feeling more personal, more emotional, and far more serious. Now people are asking questions like, was there tension that the public never saw? Were there concerns that stayed private? Or is this simply the internet amplifying ordinary family complexity into something far more dramatic? At the same time, Erika Kirk's public image has also become part of the discussion again. Every past moment is being reinterpreted, every expression, every speech, every appearance, filtered through a new wave of suspicion and speculation that wasn't there before. And that's how these narratives evolve online, not through confirmed facts, but through reinterpretation of old moments under new emotional pressure. Meanwhile, supporters of Erika argue that this entire wave of claims is being exaggerated, taken out of context, or completely fabricated by online echo chambers that thrive on controversy. But critics say the consistency of the rumors, even without confirmation, suggests there may be more going on beneath the surface than people realize. And that tension between belief and disbelief is exactly what keeps this story alive, because neither side can fully prove their point. And in that gap, speculation grows. Now, with Charlie's sister allegedly being mentioned in connection to these claims, the narrative has shifted again. It is no longer just about public perception. It is about internal family interpretation versus external public image. And those two versions of reality rarely ever match perfectly. That's what makes this situation so explosive. Because if the internal perspective is even slightly different from the public story, people immediately start wondering what else might not align. And once that question enters the conversation, it doesn't leave easily. It spreads, it evolves, and it pulls more people into the discussion whether they want to be part of it or not. But the biggest twist in all of this is not what is being said. It's the fact that none of it is officially confirmed, yet it is still shaping how millions of people interpret the entire situation. And that alone is enough to turn a simple story into something much larger than anyone expected. Because now everyone is waiting for clarity. And in stories like this, clarity never comes quickly. The moment this story shifted from online speculation into something far more intense was when new claims started circulating that Charlie Kirk's sister wasn't just mentioned in passing anymore. She was being positioned at the center of a narrative that suddenly felt much more personal, much more emotional, and far more divisive than anything that had come before. And that's where everything escalated. Because according to viral discussions spreading across social platforms, there were allegedly private family concerns that never fully matched the public image of Erika Kirk's relationship and role within Charlie's life. Now, it's important to be clear, none of this is officially verified, but in the world of viral controversy, perception often moves faster than confirmation. And right now, perception is everything. The online conversation began shifting in a very specific direction. People started revisiting earlier moments that once seemed normal and reinterpreting them as if they were clues to a hidden narrative. Old interviews were rewatched, public appearances were dissected frame by frame. Even casual expressions were being analyzed like evidence in a case study. And suddenly, nothing felt neutral anymore. Everything felt suspicious. According to the viral claims, Charlie's sister is allegedly hinting that there were moments behind the scenes where the public image did not fully align with private reality. Some online users interpret this as emotional distance within the family dynamic, while others believe it refers to differences in perspective about Erika's role. But because nothing is directly confirmed, the ambiguity is what fuels the fire. And that ambiguity is dangerous in viral storytelling, because it allows every viewer to fill in the gaps with their own interpretation. Then came the first major twist that intensified everything. A series of anonymous posts began circulating, claiming that internal disagreements within close circles had existed for a while, but were never made public due to the sensitivity of the situation and the desire to maintain a controlled public image. Again, no proof is attached to these claims, but the way they are being framed online gives them emotional weight. And emotional weight spreads faster than facts. The story then takes another turn when people begin connecting these claims to broader ideas of influence, control, and narrative management within high-profile political environments. Some users started suggesting that public-facing relationships in such circles are often under extreme pressure, not just from personal dynamics, but also from external expectations, organizational branding, and constant media scrutiny. This interpretation adds a completely different layer to the situation. Now, it's no longer just a relationship being questioned, it's a system being questioned. And that shift is what pushes the story into full escalation mode. At this point, social media reacts like a pressure cooker. Comment sections turn into debates. Hashtags start trending again. Reaction videos multiply, and every new post adds another layer of interpretation. One side insists that this is simply a case of the internet, over-analyzing a normal family situation and turning it into something dramatic for attention. The other side argues that the consistency of recurring themes, distance, tension, and narrative control suggests there may be more complexity than people initially believed. And neither side can fully prove their position. That's what keeps the conflict alive. Then comes the emotional escalation. Posts begin appearing where users claim they feel something was off about the public image. Others say they noticed changes in tone, behavior, or messaging over time. None of these observations are factual evidence, but they contribute to the emotional atmosphere of the story. And in viral narratives, atmosphere is everything, because it shapes how people interpret every new detail. Meanwhile, Erika Kirk's name becomes increasingly central in the discussion again. Not because of any new official statement, but because of how frequently she is being referenced in connection with these circulating claims. Old clips are resurfacing and being reinterpreted through a completely different emotional lens. Moments that once looked routine now appear symbolic to some viewers. And that reinterpretation cycle is what drives the first major twist of this story. Because once people start rereading the past through a new narrative, the past stops being fixed. It becomes flexible, and flexible narratives are where conspiracy-style storytelling thrives. At the same time, supporters of Erika and Charlie push back strongly, arguing that none of this reflects reality, and that online speculation is distorting normal human relationships into exaggerated theories. They emphasize that family dynamics are complex, and not everything private translates into public conspiracy. But even this defense struggles to slow down the momentum, because the internet isn't just reacting anymore, it's building. And once a narrative starts building itself, it becomes very difficult to stop. The first major twist, then, isn't a single event. It's the realization that there are now two competing versions of reality forming at the same time, one based on public image and known facts, and another built entirely from interpretation, speculation, and emotional inference, and both versions are spreading simultaneously, which leads to a far more unsettling question that nobody can fully answer yet. If these two realities continue to diverge, which one will people eventually accept as truth? And that question is where everything starts to get even more unstable. Because once belief splits like this, the next escalation is almost guaranteed. At this point, the story stopped behaving like a normal online debate. It turned into something far more chaotic. Because the moment two competing versions of truth started circulating at the same time, the internet did what it always does. It amplified both until neither could be ignored. And that's when the escalation hit full speed. Suddenly, social media wasn't just discussing Charlie Kirk and Erika Kirk anymore. It was dissecting every possible angle of their entire public and private timeline, trying to find consistency in a narrative that was becoming increasingly fragmented. And the more people looked, the more questions appeared. Anonymous posts began circulating again, this time claiming that individuals close to the situation had privately expressed concerns, long before anything became public discussion. These posts didn't include names, dates, or verifiable proof, but they were written in a way that made them feel personal, almost like insider commentary. And that emotional framing was enough to make them spread rapidly. Within hours, the discussion exploded across multiple platforms. Reaction accounts started breaking down every detail. Commentary channels jumped in with hour-long analysis videos. Short clips went viral, showing old interviews being reinterpreted in real time, and with every repost, the narrative grew louder. Then came the first major wave of interpretation threads. Users began connecting unrelated public moments and framing them as part of a larger pattern. A shift in tone here. A change in phrasing there. A pause in an interview. A facial expression in a public appearance. Individually, none of these moments meant anything. But together, online, we're being presented as something more structured, something intentional, something suspicious. And that's where the story became dangerous in a different way. Because once people start building meaning out of fragments, the original context gets lost completely. At the same time, Erika Kirk's presence in the narrative intensified again. Not because of new verified information, but because older content featuring her was being circulated with new commentary layered on top. Every clip became a clue in the eyes of some viewers. Every statement became a hint to others, and every silence became its own kind of statement. That's how escalation works in viral storytelling. It feeds on reinterpretation. Then the situation took another turn when a new wave of posts began suggesting that internal communication within certain circles had become unusually quiet. Not official statements, just claims from anonymous accounts saying that people involved are avoiding direct clarification, which immediately sparked speculation about why. And of course, the internet filled in the blanks. Some users interpreted silence as confirmation that something was being hidden. Others argued it was simply a refusal to engage with baseless rumors. But neither side could fully shut the other down, and so the argument kept growing. Then came the most dramatic shift yet. A series of viral claims suggested that there were private conversations being referenced indirectly across different online discussions. Conversations that allegedly pointed to tension between public image and private reality. Again, nothing was confirmed, but the phrasing was enough to trigger a new wave of engagement. Because the idea of private truth versus public narrative is one of the most powerful engines in online controversy. It creates curiosity, it creates doubt, and it creates endless interpretation loops. Meanwhile, public reaction outside of social media commentary became increasingly divided. Some viewers insisted the entire situation was a manufactured internet story, built from speculation and amplified misunderstanding. Others believed that the repetition of similar themes across multiple independent discussions suggested there might be some underlying reality people were picking up on. And that disagreement only intensified the reach of the story. Then something even more significant happened in the narrative cycle. Old content featuring Charlie Kirk and Erika Kirk began resurfacing again. But this time it wasn't just being shared. It was being analyzed like evidence. Every word was slowed down. Every moment was paused. Every expression was reinterpreted through the lens of the current controversy. And that reinterpretation changed how people perceived even neutral interactions. What once felt like normal public behavior now felt loaded with meaning to some viewers, and that shift is exactly what drives escalation to its peak. Because once the past becomes reinterpretable, there is no fixed foundation left. Everything becomes negotiable, everything becomes debatable, and that creates endless momentum. At the same time, supporters of Erika and Charlie pushed back harder, accusing online communities of creating narratives out of nothing and turning private life into public spectacle. They argued that this kind of speculation often spirals far beyond reality, reshaping ordinary situations into exaggerated stories driven by engagement rather than truth. But even strong pushback couldn't slow the momentum anymore, because by this point, the narrative had already spread too widely. It was no longer controlled by any single group. It was being built collectively by millions of interpretations happening simultaneously. And that collective storytelling is what makes viral escalation so powerful and so unpredictable. Then came the shocking reveal moment of this phase. A new wave of posts suggested that the reason this story keeps resurfacing isn't because of one specific event, but because there are still unanswered gaps in the public understanding that people keep trying to fill. And as long as those gaps exist, the speculation will continue evolving. Because the internet doesn't wait for official closure, it creates its own. And in this case, that closure still doesn't exist, which means the escalation isn't over yet, not even close, and the next wave is already forming in the background. By now, the situation had completely escaped the boundaries of a simple online discussion. It wasn't just trending anymore, it was becoming a full-scale public debate that kept regenerating itself with every new post, reaction, and reinterpretation. And what made it even more intense was the fact that no single side could fully control the narrative. Supporters of Charlie Kirk and Erika Kirk were quick to push back against the rising wave of speculation, calling it exaggerated, misleading, and built on fragments of unrelated content being forced together into a dramatic storyline. They argued that people online were taking normal public behavior and turning it into something far more complex than it ever actually was. To them, the situation was simple. Private lives were being unfairly reinterpreted under a spotlight of constant scrutiny. But on the other side of the internet, a very different conversation was unfolding. Critics and casual observers insisted that the consistency of recurring themes, distance, tension, reinterpretation of old moments, and alleged internal concerns was too persistent to ignore completely. They weren't necessarily claiming anything as fact, but they were questioning why the same patterns kept appearing across so many discussions. And that question alone kept the story alive. Because in viral environments, repetition creates perceived significance. The more something is mentioned, the more it feels meaningful even without proof. Meanwhile, commentary channels and reaction creators turned the situation into long-form analysis content, breaking down every available clip, statement, and appearance tied to the narrative. Old interviews were replayed with new commentary overlays. Public speeches were paused mid-sentence for interpretation. Even facial expressions were being analyzed frame by frame as part of broader behavioral readings. And while this content varied in credibility, it contributed heavily to the emotional intensity surrounding the story. At the same time, social media platforms became divided spaces where discussions quickly turned into arguments. Comment sections were filled with users debating intent versus interpretation. One group insisted that nothing unusual was happening at all, and that the internet was manufacturing complexity where none existed. Another group believed there was too much overlap between claims and resurfaced content for it to be dismissed entirely as coincidence. And neither side could fully convince the other. That unresolved tension is what kept engagement high. Even outside of direct commentary, the story began influencing broader political and cultural discussions online. People started using it as an example of how public figures are constantly reinterpreted under digital scrutiny. Others used it to argue that online platforms are too quick to amplify unverified narratives. And some simply engaged with it as entertainment, treating it like an unfolding serialized drama. Meanwhile, Erika Kirk's name remained central in nearly every version of the conversation. Not because of any new official development, but because of how frequently she was being referenced in reinterpretations of past content. Every clip involving her became a point of discussion. Every old appearance became a potential context clue, and every silence became something people tried to decode. That cycle made the narrative self-sustaining. Even without new information, the conversation kept generating itself. Then came another wave of online reaction that intensified everything again. A set of posts began circulating claiming that the reason the story continues to gain traction is because it touches on deeper questions about trust, influence, and how public narratives are shaped in high-visibility environments. This interpretation didn't introduce new facts, but it reframed the entire discussion emotionally, and reframing is powerful, because it changes how people feel about what they already know or think they know. As a result, the conversation became less about specific claims and more about interpretation of patterns. Some users began insisting that where there is smoke, there is fire, while others pushed back hard against what they saw as emotional reasoning replacing factual evidence. That divide only widened the audience engagement further, and as engagement grew, so did the scale of the narrative itself. At this point, even people who were not initially following the story began encountering it through clips, summaries, and reaction content, which meant the discussion was no longer confined to niche communities. It was becoming mainstream internet conversation. And once that happens, narratives tend to evolve faster than they can be clarified, because everyone adds their own layer of interpretation. Everyone reshapes the story slightly differently. And over time, the original context becomes harder and harder to separate from commentary. That's exactly what was happening here. And the result was a deeply fragmented public perception where no single version of the story could dominate completely. Instead, multiple interpretations coexisted at once. And that coexistence is what fuels ongoing controversy. Because as long as there is no definitive resolution, every side continues to believe there is still more to understand. And that belief is what keeps the cycle alive. Even now, the conversation shows no sign of slowing down. In fact, it's still expanding, which leads directly into the next phase, where one final narrative shift threatens to change everything people think they already understood. And that shift is closer than anyone realizes. Just when it looked like the conversation was starting to stabilize, something unexpected reignited the entire situation again. Because instead of fading out like most online controversies eventually do, this one took a sharp turn in intensity, almost like it was refusing to end. And that's when the final twist began forming. New viral posts started circulating, claiming that the reason this entire story keeps resurfacing isn't just because of speculation or reinterpretation, but because there are still missing pieces in the timeline that no one has ever clearly addressed. And that idea changed everything. Because once people start believing there are missing pieces, every detail suddenly becomes suspicious again. Even the quiet ones. Even the already explained ones. The narrative shifted from what happened to what hasn't been explained yet. And that shift is what pushed the story into its most unstable phase. Online creators began compiling final breakdown videos, presenting timelines that stretched across years, highlighting every alleged inconsistency that had been discussed in fragments before. But this time, something was different. The tone wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was certainty. Certainty built on interpretation, not evidence, but certainty nonetheless. And that emotional confidence spread fast. Within hours, the story was trending again, not as a rumor cycle, but as a developing situation in the eyes of many viewers. Then came the moment that intensified everything. A new wave of anonymous claims suggested that individuals previously mentioned in the broader discussion were now avoiding direct commentary entirely, which immediately triggered speculation about silence being intentional. Some interpreted it as strategic avoidance. Others saw it as confirmation that things were being handled privately. And once again, both interpretations fueled completely opposite conclusions. But neither side had proof, only perception. And perception is what drives viral chaos. Then the narrative took another emotional turn. Old clips of Erika Kirk and Charlie Kirk were once again resurfaced, but this time they were being edited into emotional highlight reels across different platforms. Not altered in a factual sense, but recontextualized through commentary and selective framing. Moments of laughter were labeled as performative. Pauses were labeled as tension. Normal interactions were reframed as signs. And suddenly, the entire past felt like it was being rewritten in real time. That's what made this phase so powerful and so unsettling for many viewers. Because once reinterpretation becomes widespread, the original meaning of events starts to disappear. At the same time, supporters of the couple doubled down, insisting that the entire wave of content was built on selective editing and narrative exaggeration. They argued that the internet was taking fragmented moments and stitching them together into something that never existed in reality. But even their pushback couldn't stop the momentum anymore. Because by now, the story had become self-sustaining. It didn't need new facts. It only needed new interpretations, and those were arriving every minute. Then came the final emotional shockwave of this cycle. A new viral thread claimed that the real issue behind all of this isn't any single event, relationship detail, or public moment, but the way modern audiences consume fragmented narratives and turn them into full-scale stories without complete information. That interpretation hit differently, because it shifted the focus away from individuals and onto the audience itself. Suddenly, people weren't just watching the story, they were part of it. And that realization created even more engagement, but it also made the entire situation feel more unresolved than ever. Because if the story is being shaped collectively, then there is no single ending, only continuous evolution. And that's exactly where this narrative is now trapped. In a loop of interpretation, reaction, and reinvention. And just when it feels like everything has been said, something new always appears to pull it back into motion, which leads directly into the final stage. The moment where the audience is no longer just watching the story unfold, but actively deciding where it goes next. And just like that, this entire situation refuses to slow down. Because every time it feels like the noise is settling, something new pulls it right back into the spotlight again. Different claims, different interpretations, different angles, all pointing in different directions, yet somehow feeding the same growing storm. At this point, the biggest question isn't just what happened. It's why this story has managed to keep everyone so divided for so long. And more importantly, what are people actually supposed to believe when every side is presenting a completely different version of reality? Some viewers are convinced there's far more beneath the surface than what's publicly visible, pointing to timing, connections, and resurfaced moments that keep fueling suspicion. Others strongly believe the entire narrative has been blown out of proportion, shaped by selective clips, online speculation, and emotional storytelling that's running far ahead of any confirmed facts. And that's where things get even more interesting. Because the internet isn't just watching this story anymore, it's actively shaping it. Every comment adds another layer. Every reaction adds another angle. Every theory adds another branch to the narrative. So now the question is simple but loaded. Do you think this is just another case of online exaggeration taking over a real-life situation? Or do you believe there are still unanswered gaps that people are ignoring on purpose? Drop your thoughts below, because this is one of those stories where every opinion feels like it changes the direction of the entire conversation. And if you've been following this from the start, you already know, this is far from the end. There are still clips resurfacing, still claims being debated, still reactions building in real time. Which means one thing is certain, this story is not closing anytime soon. So stay tuned, stay alert, and make sure you're subscribed, because the next update might completely flip everything again. And when it does, you'll want to be here first.